Good afternoon and welcome to Tafakari. If you're new here, Tafakari is a Kiswahili term that means to ponder, to contemplate, or to think deeply. And it is the intention of this space to encourage critical thinking for the purposes of developing effective solutions to meet the challenges of our times. So today we shall be speaking about the coloniality of knowledge, and specifically the what, the why, and the how, and why it matters in 2026, more so within the space of AI. So the coloniality of knowledge essentially refers to the elevation of Western ways of knowing, seeing, and imagining. And what this means is that since Europe's advent of modernity, or since Europe's development process began, their ways of seeing, imagining, and knowing were elevated above those of non-Western people. So that for Black people, indigenous people, as well as people of color, or in general, anybody divorced from whiteness, their epistemologies were either silenced, marginalized, or appropriated where needed. And how was this implemented? Now it depends, because you need to understand that coloniality, which is the dark side of what it took for Europe to get where it needed to get, has been characterized by diverse processes across the centuries, from mercantilism to imperialism to slavery to colonialism to apartheid, and currently under development. So that when we are talking about, the brute era, that is slavery, colonialism, apartheid, the silencing or the marginalization of non-Western knowledges was imposed through, for example, linguicide, the extermination as well as the subjugation of languages, indigenous languages. We're also speaking about subjugation of religions, the banning of African religions, and not even just African, generally, anything to do with any person of color, who, as well as indigenous, as well as Black people. There was the subjugation of their religions, subjugation of their epistemologies, subjugation of their languages, and all this together constitute a coloniality of knowledge. Now you have to be asking yourself, why would somebody be interested in that? Because how you see, how you imagine, how you know determines your future. And so, if imperialist ambitions can get a foothold on that, then they're able to continue the project of coloniality, because the non-Western subject's way of knowing, seeing, and imagining conforms to the imperialist agenda. It's as simple as that. So now we have to ask ourselves, why does this matter in 2026, more so for AI development? And I want to start with the idea that, one must be wondering, how can we be talking about coloniality in 2026? And it depends, because if you ask historians, what we got in the 60s, more so for areas that experienced colonialism, that is what they call flag independence. So that essentially, yes, you have a Black president, you have your own rulership, you have your own people on your currencies, but still, we are still under the yoke of Euro-North American-centric domination, politically, socially, epistemologically, as well as culturally. And because we are in a post-colonial society, quote unquote, the imposition of the coloniality of knowledge is slightly different. And this is where I like a particular paper by Morgan Love, where it says that it's through funding. Yes, the funding that so many of us think is so benevolent, so important. It's through funding that the coloniality of knowledge is extended and propagated. Because through the funding, first of all, the scope of what and what cannot be explored is articulated. Because the moment you have a funding call, then obviously there's a scope. And that means already your way of knowing, seeing, and imagining is confined to certain areas that conform to the funding party. But aside from that, there's what he talks about, which is the surveillance and patrol. And this is very important because it is in surveilling and patrolling that conversations that speak truth to power, or in general critical scholarship, is monitored. And, dissenting voices that upstate the status quo are managed. And you might be asking, why is it important? It's important because much as colonialism in its brute era ended, the project of coloniality is still alive and well. So that because it is important to imperialist powers to maintain the Euro-North American status quo power structure, that is, it becomes very important to manage ways of seeing, knowing, and imagining. And which is why I was very surprised when I was watching Fixing the Nation, where a discussion on the AI bill was being held. And in the process, I learned that we have two important processes that are externally funded. One was supposed to be an AI policy process. Another was a data protection framework. And it just occurred to me to ask myself, why are our things externally funded? More so critical legislation that should be contextual, that should be situated, and that should be internally driven. Because the reality is, even if we have black faces, we have African black practitioners, at the end of the day, as Thomas Sankara said, he who feeds you controls you. So at the end of the day, when we have this lens of the coloniality of knowledge, we need to start questioning funding. Because it's through funding that we have external impositions. And also because it's surprising because it's very easy to believe that we are resource constrained, but those of us in the global south, where corruption is the norm every day, is it really believable that we don't have money to fund our own internal policy process? But more so, aside from it being not believable, is this particular concern where we say it is through such funding that our way of knowing, seeing, and imagining is circumscribed. And it is through such funding that we have a lot of impositions of things that are not to our interest. And I like how this was brought out by an article that Kofi Yeboah wrote. And where is my phone? So in this particular article, which is titled, the article is titled "The Paradox of Africa's Autonomy in Shaping its AI Future." And in this article, he particularly mentions an uproar around what was a new AI continental strategy. And with respect to this, the uproar, was as a result of the feeling among practitioners that this was not situated, it was not attuned to our needs. And part of that uproar revolved around funding, as a way of imposing external ideas or interests. And I'll just read a section of it where he says, with respect to this AI continental strategy, he says, although initially well celebrated, the 66-page strategy, supported financially and technically by UNESCO, has drawn criticisms for failing to integrate or reconcile existing documents into a coherent framework for Africa, lacking a robust public consultation process and citing only one African-based researcher. Some critics allege that it was heavily influenced by foreign tech lobbyists, did not adequately reflect the diverse priorities of member states or grassroots AI communities, and omitted clear guidelines for financial investments in AI research, computing infrastructure, and skills development. Moreover, this fragmented approach to AI policy allows external stakeholders, often driven by profit or geopolitical interests, to push Africa toward technologies and regulations that may not yield sustainable or meaningfully long held benefits due to misalignment with local development needs, inadequate infrastructure, shortage of policy development capabilities, and weak state institutions. So there you have it. And that's why it's so important that we have critical scholarship, more so right now that we are working towards AI sovereignty, so as to interrogate, when are we shooting ourselves in the foot? When are we not? So this was what I had for the coloniality of knowledge. And until next time, kwaherini.